Why Russia wasted 100,000 men in Bachmut? Nu, davai, nežinau, apie ką kalbės, bet pradžiai pažiūrim šitą.
This is Bachmut.
Per 100 tūkstančių patvirtinta. Aš irgi galvojau, kad,
More accurately,
kad ten labai jau didelis tas skaičius.
To say that Bachmut has been
Tai
destroyed.
ir aš mačiau, kad ten spėja skaičių, estimatina skaičių, kad ten nuo 7 iki 100 tūkstančių, nuo 7 tūkstančių iki 100 tūkstančių, legit vien Bachmute buvo arba užmušta, arba sužalota, kartu su jėmus. Jeigu taip, tai jaučiu gal ir realus skaičius, nes ten jie kažkaip skaičiavo, kiek iš kalėjimų rekrūtino, kiek ten buvo, žodžiu, aš nežinau, bet čia man atrodo tiesiog aukštesnis skaičius, bet nėra patvirtintas, nes jokie skaičiai nėra patvirtinti.
It would be an understatement. This city has been obliterated by Russian artillery, tanks, and small arms fire, having experienced more fighting than just about anywhere else in Ukraine following Putin's invasion in 2022. Russia has paid a high cost trying to capture this city. According to White House estimates, the Russian military has suffered no less than 100,000 casualties here, including both dead and injured, also bearing a similarly high cost in terms of financial resources and military equipment, with Russia having sacrificed more soldiers here than Bakhmut ever had in population, and more money than Bakhmut's economy ever produced. This is obviously bad.
Wow, Karalius.
Let's put that in perspective, because large numbers can quickly become meaningless. To demonstrate just how wasteful this battle has really been, Russia has lost more troops trying to capture this small Ukrainian city than the United States lost in the historic Battle of the Bulge. One of the most
Iš esmės, tu apsinuodėjai, nes valgiai maistą. Ir tai yra tiesiog įrodymas, kad maistas nuodė žmonės.
costly battles for the U.S.
Ir išvada nustok valgyti.
Which resulted in more than 19,000 U.S. troops killed and more than 80,000 wounded. The difference is, in the Battle of the Bulge, the sacrifice ultimately paid off, as that battle changed the trajectory of World War II and ultimately led to the complete surrender.
But the
same cannot be said of Russia and Bakhmut, because while Russia has suffered catastrophic losses, far from changing the trajectory of the war, their strategic gains in Bakhmut have been lackluster at best, and potentially devastating to the entire Russian war.
Bet palarim tai, Bachmutą, gerai, paėmė Bachmutą ir tom ir baigės. Ir dabar jie tipo, jį turi, bet ten sako, va čia bus kaip taškas, iš kurio ten toliau rusais, bet jie toliau net neina. Jie tiesiog norėjo paimti Bachmutą kaip kad iš tikro, kad paėmėm. Bet that's it. Ir jie dabar ten sėdi ir, ir žmonės prognozuoja, kad ten jis jau greitai gali būti apsuptas ir ukrainiečiai gali atsimti. Bet realiai iš jo nieko nebuvo, rusai ten gavo kažką iš to Bachmuto, rimtai. Nes pradžioje sakė, kad ten strateginis objektas, visai nėra strateginis objektas, paskui sako, kad yra kaip ir, kad ten iš to artilerija sieks ir panašiai daugiau vietų, bet rusai toliau nieko su to nedarė, tiesiog paėmė ir viską. Tai tikrai čia neapsimokėjo, metus imti tą Bachmutą su absurdiškais nuostoliais, I don't know.
Effort at worst. That's because if Russia managed to fully capture and hold Bakhmut, that would not mean they were out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. Just a few kilometers to the west, Ukraine has already set defensive positions on hills that would be even easier for them to defend than Bakhmut, meaning that Russia has effectively sacrificed 100,000 troops just to earn the right to fight even harder and sacrifice even more somewhere else. A reality that must be especially discouraging for their soldiers, given the horrors they have already experienced in this battle, which would be difficult to overstate. During the past 5 months fighting for the city, the Russian and Ukrainian armies have found themselves stuck in a vicious gridlock, where soldiers have become locked in brutal combat reminiscent of the combined horrors of the worst of World War I and the worst of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars at the same time, complete with trench warfare, endless artillery shelling, a no-man's zone filled with landmines, and terrifying house-to-house fighting, where you never know if an enemy is going to be around the next corner, not to mention the addition of new modern technology like drones and precision rockets, which can strike anywhere, at any time, with little to no warning. It's the kind of battle that doesn't just wear you down physically, but breaks you down mentally as well. A psychological hell where no soldier wants to go, and the kind of place from which many never mentally return, even if physically they manage to survive. You would think that for Russia to force their soldiers to make these kinds of sacrifices, Bakhmut must be a place of pivotal strategic importance to their war effort, and that would only make sense, especially if Russia cared about their troops as much as Vladimir Putin claims it does. But the truth is, this is probably not the case. Because despite the fact...
Šiandien aš turėjau komentarą, kai mes žiūrėjome laidą iš esmės, ten apie narkotikus ir svaigalus. Ir šiandien YouTube komentarą parašė. I shit you not, aš paskaitysiu tą komentarą, čia labai trumpas interpas, čia man priminė, kai čia pasakė, kad Putinui rūpi kariai, žinai, Rusijos kariai. Ir paskaitysiu komentarą, kur jisai buvo šitas komentaras. Tarybų sąjungoje tokių kaip narkotikų nebuvo nė lašo. Nes sąjunga rūpinosi savo žmonėmis. Kai tik vakarai sugriovė TSSR, tai iš karto pradėjo plūsti narkotikai į buvusias TSSR šalis. Daugiausia narkotikų pasiekdavo ir pasiekė iš Afganistano. Čia jau yra realiai, ką rašo. Iš esmės, prie Ruso buvo geriau, bet sakyti, kad narkotikų nebuvo, nelašo, nes rūpėjo žmonės. Eik, galvoju. Kaip tokie žmonės išgyvena iš vis planetai? Kaip jie gyvi? Kaip tokio tupumo žmonės iš tikro gyvi? Dabar tiesiog nuo krokodilų visokių pūna kalėjimuose ten arba kare miršta iš kalėjimų, bet jo rūpi žmonėm ir jie vat... Dar ir netgi tos pusės, gerai, alkoholis. Kaip alkoholis tada... Pilinkėk alkoholizmo, jiems tas ne narkotikas techniškai, nesusiję, ne to. Žodžiu, bet jo, tas toksai, vat, grinai prie Ruso buvo geriau. Čia grinas, va, toks. Bet jo, man yra fascinating, kaip tokie protiniai atsilikėliai iš tikrųjų išgyvena ir greičiausiai turi visai reasonable darbus, bet kaip sakiau, protingas žmogus nuo savo profesijos yra tiesiog atskirtas. Visiškai totalus idiotai, bet... Taip užtikrintai, tas žmogus rašo tiek daug komentarų, kad wow, gerai, tai jo. Putinui tikrai rūpi, Rusijai tikrai rūpi.
The reality is that expert military analysts, including NATO chiefs and representatives from the Pentagon, have downplayed Bakhmut's strategic importance, with many experts who comment on the situation struggling to comprehend why, from a military perspective, Russia decided to keep the pressure on. It's not to say that Bakhmut has no strategic importance at all. Nobody is saying this because capturing Bakhmut would, in fact, provide some benefit for Russia.
Okay, what benefit?
For one, Bakhmut is, or at least was, a regional transport and logistics hub, which could be used to help supply the Russian troops along the front line. And more than that, Bakhmut's location could help to provide an important springboard for Russia as it tried to capture two other cities in the region, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which were an important part of Russia's originally stated goals for the invasion. So, the strategic value is there, potentially. But what is really puzzling to the experts here is not the existence of strategic value, but the cost at which that value has been pursued. Because any strategic benefit that could come from capturing Bakhmut has been far outweighed by the cost that Russia has invested trying to obtain it. To put it in simpler terms, Russia's actions here were like paying $1 million to build the nicest, most extravagant garage in the world, whose only purpose was to protect a $30,000 car from potential theft or bad weather, and then beating your chest in victory as if you had done a great thing, when in reality, you could have just bought more than 30 of those cars for the same price without having to even go to the trouble of the garage, or just insured the car against theft and damage for pennies on the dollar. But then again, you can put your name on that garage, and other people will see it years from now and think, wow, what a nice garage. The person who built this must have been really important. There's that. When you control the media and the history books, perception is everything, and costs, they can simply be swept under the rug. This might seem exaggerated or silly, but in reality, it is almost exactly what Russia's politicians have done every time they gain a small victory in Ukraine at a massive cost to their own nation, pounding their chests as if they have accomplished a great victory over the West, a victory that they inevitably portray as having nearly unlimited value. In reality, they could have gotten more real benefits for Russia by simply doing nothing. Or, at the very least, cutting their losses when the cost became greater than the potential benefit. With 100,000 men of fighting age, and the financial resources given to the military campaign in Bakhmut, Russia could have done something truly extraordinary for their country. For example, they might even have been able to finally build a functional highway system across more of Siberia, one that was actually fully paved, and which didn't flood all the time. making it unusable for much of the year. Or maybe they could even have just fixed their existing roads, so that Russia didn't inadvertently subsidize the entire global rubber industry by blowing up excessive quantities of tires with its incessant potholes that make many important Russian roads practically useless. But then again, that one's not that likely, because if they got rid of those money-sucking holes, Russia's politicians might be the only ones left to point at. Russia could have even done something as simple as finally providing functional plumbing and electricity for more of its population, much of which still lives in third world conditions, and the list goes on and on. Heck, even spending $85 billion to fix just one Russian pothole would have been more valuable than this entire pointless war. But doing things like this that provide actual benefit...
Kai tokius dalykus sako, čia matos kalbai jau šališkas video, aišku, irgi, visi tą suprantam, kai tokius video žiūrim, bet, čia nėra teisybė, tipo. Nebent ukrainiečiai tikrai atsims viską, yra naudos tame, tame visame kare Rusijai. Jie ten gauna tą prieimą iki Krymo, vis tiek gauna land bridge'ą, kaip suprantu, resursų gauna, ten tuos pyzdina, ten tuos ir grainus, taigi viską, tipo, naudos gauna. Čia klausimas, ar tos ir sankcijos, ir susilpnėjus ekonomika, ir, reputacinė žala, ar visas tas atpirks tą naudą, kur gauna. Nes karo pradžioje lygtais taip ir sakė, žinai. Pradžioje rusam ta strategija visai neblogai gavos. Invadini šalį, prisijungi šalies teritorijos savo ir jo, ta uždeda gal sankcijas, gal kažkas pasmerkia, bet realiai tu išėjai labai neblogam pliuse. Šitoj situacijai, čia klausimas jau, ar jie tikrai išeis į pliusą. Bet jo, nes, su šituo karu jau Rusijai buvo smarkiai kliuvo. Bet taip sakyti, kad, čia visiškai pointless, čia gana depend, I guess, ir dar kol kas ukrainiečiai neatsiėmė nieko, žinai, ir vis dar praradė teritorijų, bent jau tos, kur Rusai norėjo techniškai, gal ne visas, bet bent dalį to land bridge'o iki Krymo.
To the Russian people, becoming the unifier of Siberia, or the savior of Russian tires, wallets, and rear ends, just doesn't ring as well in the history books as the great liberator of the persecuted Russian compatriots living in former Soviet territory. Even if, in the process of supposedly liberating those so-called compatriots, you just managed to destroy their entire city of 70,000 people and turn it into a pile of rubble. They were liberated, all right. Liberated from their rights, their homes, their families, their identities, and their futures. But as far as Putin's concerned, if they're not happy about that, then so be it. All joking aside, Russia could have built a better life for its people, but instead chose to sacrifice the lives or futures of 100,000 of those same people in the trenches of Bachmut, giving up many more men and resources to capture the city than they could ever hope to regain if they even managed to hold it. Which begs the question, why did Russia do this? What was their strategic goal? And what was the end game that caused them to push so hard for this single piece of territory? We've already discussed the potential strategic value of Bakhmut, and found it to not be worth the cost that has been paid. So now it's time to look at things from another angle, where we consider Bakhmut not from the perspective of its strategic value to Russia as a nation, but rather from the perspective of its strategic value to key Russian politicians, as a political play to increase or preserve their own personal power. Not surprisingly, it is here that things finally start to make sense. As we consider this, if you're enjoying this analysis, consider leaving a super thanks or becoming a channel member to help fund future videos and support our work. If you happen to live in Russia and were watching media coverage of this war, or as they call it over there, this special military operation, you would be likely to see a few different things. One would be Putin rambling on about the threat of NATO, just like your crazy old uncle does every Thursday evening at the family gathering. Another would be propaganda of the Russian government providing token gifts to the wives of fallen soldiers, who then obligingly express their gratitude to Putin that he let their men fall in his place, so that they don't risk going to prison for being negative about the campaign that their husbands pointlessly died in. Then you would hit a commercial break, where you would probably see a recruitment ad telling you that there was an opportunity to finally earn a living wage and provide for your family by going to war and fighting on the front line for Putin, with the added bonus that your wife too could have the opportunity to show up on state TV in just a few short weeks. Not months, because there's a good chance you'll miss basic training. which isn't needed when your only job is to run hopelessly at the enemy's front line in exchange for a bit of ribbon and tin. And last but not least would be the nightly coverage of the battle for Bakhmut, which has been portrayed to the Russian people practically as if it were the only hope for national survival against the Western aggressors, who, ironically, Russia aggressively attacked. Indeed, more than anywhere else, Bakhmut has become a kind of rallying cry for the Russian media, mainly because, despite the heavy losses that have been incurred there, it is one of the only places where Russian forces have managed to make any kind of territorial gain at.
Iš esmės tikrai taip, ten, blemba, O.J. gynybui, prisimenu, nežinau, ar prisimenu tokį dalyką, buvo Amerikoje ten O.J. Simpsono žmogžudystės teismas ir tenais jį išteisino, bet realiai visą tą teismą pavertė apie vieną dalyką, ten, nu gal ne apie vieną dalyką, bet, nu, daug įrodymų, daug aplinkybių, bet ten apie pirštinę kažką pavertė. Ten netiko kažkas ir, tipo, nu, visus fokusavo į tai. Ir dažniausiai mėgsta taip, dabar irgi fronte, ten 100 visokių mūšių, kaimelių, dar kažko. Bet yra gerai tą karą supaprastinti, vat, Bachmutas. Bachmutą paimsim ir laimėjom karą. Ir čia yra viskas. Nesvarbu, ten niekur kitur, niekas, kur juda, kur nejuda. Jo, supaprastinę žmonės, nu, negali tiek sekti, net jeigu labai domėtus negali tiek sekti. Ir tau palanku yra tas, aišku. Nes jeigu tu tiek resursų meti į Bachmutą ir galų gale, nu, žinai, kad paimsi, kokią kainą be paimtum, tu paskui galėsi sakyti, kad laimėjom, nes tu visą tą karą pavertei vienu dalyku. Tai Bachmutą ar paims ar ne.
At all over the past several months. As such, Russia takes an inch in Bakhmut, and the state media inevitably describes the gain as if it were 100 miles, even if that inch is subsequently lost the following day, an event that is, conveniently, left off of the state TV broadcasts. And there's a reason for this desperate focus on this grinding battle. After nearly a year with no strategic gains in Ukraine, Russia desperately needs a win. And even more desperate than Russia is Vladimir Putin. Since the initial territorial gains following the invasion, Russia has largely been pushed back. And in their continued offensives, they have failed to capture other cities and towns along the front line over the course of the entire winter. Russia has sacrificed a lot for this war, and frankly, has not had a lot to show for it beyond the initial push, something which is becoming demoralizing for the troops, and for the nation as a whole, despite the fact that official state media doesn't allow them to show this. For Putin, this is potentially disastrous. Next year, election season will be beginning in Russia, and he has in no small way staked his entire reputation as president on his promise of victory in Ukraine, which he initially promoted as something not much different from a literal walk in the park, which, as it turns out, was actually a walk in a park riddled with barbed wire, landmines, drone strikes, and desperately positioned trenches. Because of this, Putin desperately needs a win to help him maintain his grip on power. And by surveying the battlefield, it is apparent that he has put all of his chips for this one in the small city of Bakhmut. But why has he put his focus here? Well, there's the logistical reason, and then there's the political one. Logistically, Bakhmut is a location on the Russian front line where several of their supply lines converge together, meaning that it is one of the easiest places for Russia to supply weapons and equipment to conduct attacks. Throughout the war, Russia has been hampered by extreme supply chain issues, where they can't seem to get enough weapons and equipment to the front line fast enough. This shows that the Russian front may have broken beyond the point where it can successfully supply a large-scale offensive, or an offensive in any area that lacks a plethora of potential supply routes. Since Bakhmut is one of the few places that has a plethora of supply routes, this means that Russia has few, and perhaps no places it can actually attack as effectively as it can here, meaning that however high the losses may be in Bakhmut, they would potentially be even higher if Russia attacked anywhere else with the same fervor. If this is true, the choice to focus on this city is not really a choice of long-term macro strategy, but rather a choice of temporary convenience, where Putin is focused on the one place he feels he can be sure of capturing before the elections next year. And speaking of the elections, there's also the political considerations, which add another aspect to this goal. When Putin originally invaded Ukraine, he had the goal of capturing the entire Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and, to his credit, he has captured much of them, but he can't yet say that he has gathered them completely under his control. To finalize this series of conquests, and to be able to say that he has captured all of the Donbass from Ukraine, Putin must capture Bakhmut, along with a handful of other cities where Bakhmut is a prerequisite to their invasion. Politically, if Putin were able to capture all of these objectives, he could save face by demonstrating that he is able to deliver on his promises. As the election season creeps up, this may explain why Putin is maniacally throwing more and more soldiers at the problem, as he is desperate to break through and achieve the goal before he runs out of time. For Putin, the loss of soldiers' lives can be explained away through vague references to the glory of the Russian state, a few patriotic ceremonies, and lump sum payments to the victims' families to get them to be quiet. An unfortunate loss, but for him, something that is tolerable, as long as it does not affect him personally. On the flip side, his inability to capture territory from what he has described as an inferior enemy could be potentially crippling to his own political future, which he has made dependent on his ability to stand up to and defeat the West. Because of this, there may be no limit to what Putin is willing to gamble. From one perspective, Putin has already experienced losses in Ukraine, and the backlash that has come with them, so further losses won't really hurt him much more politically than current losses already have. On the flip side, a political win, say a map showing a Russian flag over the entire Donbas region, would have great value to him, making this a morbid situation where Putin personally has a lot to gain and very little to lose by ordering wave after wave of soldiers to break against Ukraine's front line. While victory at this cost makes zero sense from a military perspective or from a national strategic perspective, it makes complete sense from the perspective of a crazed dictator desperate to hold on to his power for a few more years. These losses may not be rational, but then again, if war was rational, it wouldn't exist in the first place. The sad part for Russia is that if they would have just chosen to maintain their front lines, rather than desperately trying to capture Bakhmut to help Putin and his cronies save face, they could have accomplished most of their original objective to capture the Donbas region for just a fraction of the cost. But for Putin, most of the objective isn't enough to satisfy his pride or political goals. And for that extra sliver of Ukraine, for that extra dot on the map, which, even if won, will be little more than a completely devastated battlefield of artillery shells and rubble, there seems to be no limit to the number of Russian lives he is willing to throw at the problem. So Putin's political goals help us to understand the situation in Bakhmut, but let's not pretend for a minute that Putin is the only one with something to gain from all of this. Because aside from protecting Putin's reputation, there's at least one more Russian who has a lot to gain if Bakhmut falls into Russian hands. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the infamous billionaire Russian mercenary leader of the Wagner Group, a publicity-hungry tyrant who has staked no small part of his own reputation on capturing the city for Vladimir Putin. Prigozhin has a lot to profit, politically and monetarily, from the increased status that will come to him if he gets the credit for the victory in this area. According to many Russian generals, the battle has already been a great boon for his reputation, with one Russian officer becoming so jealous of Prigozhin that he actually ordered his soldiers to fire on the Wagner Group in a drunken rage. A brief incident of Russian civil war that may help outsiders understand the reality of Russian politics and the petty jealousy that often drives their actions, as much as, or even more than, rational thinking does. According to some, Prigozhin has his eyes on future political positions in Russia. According to others, he simply enjoys the money he's able to make off of his mercenary group. But in either case, his ability to capture Bakhmut will play a big role in his future, mainly because he must show that the Wagner Group can consistently deliver wins if he wants to stay in favor with the Russian government and earn future lucrative contracts. And to deliver these wins and keep business rolling in, Prigozhin is apparently...
Iš tikrųjų netikėtum, pažiūrėjau, tokį vaizdą, ne? Nu tie daugiabučiai, realiai panašus į kokio ten Klaipėdoje čia ar Kaune, ir tokie daugiabučiai dar randasi, tie ypač tos tamsiai raudonos, kaip ten spalvosos po dešinę. Ir aš kaip įsivaizduoju, blemba, nu ten nuvaryčiau kokį, žinai, Klaipėdą, arba netgi, nu, kur rajoną, savo, žinai, rajoną, ir tu vieną dieną matai, kur va šitaip tavo namas jau sugriautas, na, susprogdintas. Žaidimo aikštelė sugriauta, visur griuvėsi, tipo, eina savo iš tikrųjų žiaurų. Ir čia nėra kažkokio greito sutvarkymo, ar netgi, jeigu karas rytoj baigtus, Reikės milijonų žmonių, kad sutvarkytų visą šitą, arba kad ten atstatytų kažkaip paskui. Aš net įsivaizduoju, kaip, pavyzdžiui, vieną tokį daugiabutį, kiek laiko užtrunka actually sutaisyti. Paskui ten inspekcija praeiti, ar jis saugus, ar dar ką. Nu, čia tiek daug resursų ir tiek daug žmonių ir darbo jėgos paskui reikia, kad atstatyti ir padaryti gyvenamą ten, jeigu iš vis įmanoma. I don't know. Jo, karas, blet.
More than willing to cut a few corners, even if it means deceiving prisoners into joining his mercenary group, using them as meat shields to charge the front line, and hiding their deaths from their family members to avoid making timely compensation payments. You see, joining the Wagner Group isn't exactly what you would call a safe job. According to estimates, of the 50,000 Wagner Group fighters sent to Ukraine, it's thought that 30,000 of them, or 60%, have been killed or injured. And this is an estimate that may actually be drastically lower than reality, as it was made at a time when the US believed the Wagner Group had suffered a combined total of just 14,000 casualties killed or injured in Bachmut, while since then, Prigozhin himself has admitted that more than 20,000 of his soldiers died there, Bluntly stated, Russia is losing men so quickly that even the high end of the casualty estimates become outdated almost the moment they are written down. This high casualty rate isn't actually surprising. The entire reason the Wagner Group is in the area in the first place is basically to wear down Ukrainian defenses by sending wave after wave of men into dangerous territory to soften it for future advances by the more conventional Russian soldiers. And this zombie wave style invasion isn't exactly a task that most normal people are raising their hands to sign up for. So, to fill its ranks, fulfill its mission, and fill its leader's pocketbook, the Wagner Group has resorted to recruiting from one of the only places it can find men desperate enough to join them, Russian prisons, where prisoners are offered to exchange their lengthy prison sentences for just 6 months of fighting for Wagner, with many reportedly being told that they will be working in rear areas, far from the front line. As it turns out, working far from the front line is a matter of perspective. I guess in Russian, the word for rear area must actually mean in the middle of the fighting, and the word for far must actually mean...
Ant kiek rusai yra užzombinti, kad mato, kaip jų kariai miršta ir vis tiek eina kariauti, o ne bėga tiesiog iš šalies. Man atrodo, problemos yra kelios. Visų pirma, jie nemato to. Jie nemato ir mes to nematom, mes girdim nuogirdas, kas yra daugiau negu, bet jie nemato to, ypač tie, kur kalėjime sėdi, jiem atvaro pasiūlo, žiūrėk, ten 20 metų sėdėsi arba 6 mėnesius pakariauk. Ir net jeigu tau pasakytų 5% šansas, kad mirsi, čiūjų daug kas visai imtų tą šansą. Bet jo, problema yra ta, kad nemato ir čia tas pasakymas užzombinti, tipo čia...
5 feet. And if you're not happy with that interpretation of your contract, then so be it.
Ir jo, plus iš kalėjimo tu visų pirma, negalėsi pabėgti. Ir klausimas, kiek tu galimybių turėsi tokių. Net jeigu tu nesi kalėjime, žinai, ir tau reikia varyti ten, ar tu turi resursų, kad actually galėtum išvaryti, tipo. Jo, kai kurie gal pasiduoda, kai kurie iš karto, kur turėjo iš karto išvarė, ten visi, kaip ten sakė, tas drainas, kur vyksta. Tai jo, daug kas ir išvarė. Bet, tipo, aš nemanau, kad čia užzombinti, kad nepabėga iš šalies, tipo, labai daug dalykų žaidžia. Visų pirma, kad tu kiek tu informacijos iš tikro turi, kurią gauni ir tada vis tiek tau mintys yra dar dvejonė, arba toks netikėjimas, kas būtų bet kuriem žmonėm, čia, gan žmogiška savybė, nežinau.
Let's not neglect to mention that this is all done with just a month or so of training, because apparently there's no sense in training new Wagner fighters longer than this, since the plan...
Jo, ir galų gale tu, žinai, pradėsi kovoti, nes tave bando užmušti tenais, gal ir norėjai pasiduoti, bet, nėra kaip, žinai, kai kuriem jo zaibis pasiseka, kai dronas tiesiog tau leidžia paskui jį sekti, žinai, į tave ten pradeda šaudyti, tu kažkaip išgyveni, bet kiek tokių, kaip taip, žinai. Jo, ir kai kurie pasidavė jo, bet tada... Tavo draugeliai galbūt netoli ir jie tenai, žinai, vis tiek tavo šalies žmonės, žinai, ir jums puola. Ir dabar tau vienas gina nugarą, tu tada jam turi ginti. Ir, tipo, aš nemanau, kad tas užzombinimas čia yra, iš vis reiktų vartoti. Yra labai daug situacijų, kur pastatysi žmonės ir jie plius minus reaguos panašiai, nuspėjamai, kaip ir turėtų toje situacijoje reaguoti ir kaip, spėtumėm, kad jie reaguos toje situacijoje. Ir kad bet kurios šalies žmogų tu padėtum į tokią situaciją ir būtų labai panašiai. Tai jo, Jo, tas, man atrodo, reikia vengti to žodžio zombinimą, nes taip nėra, tai tiesiog kai kurie sure, bet jo, tada, žmonės tiesiog tokie yra, čia ne tai, kad Rusijos žmonės, tiesiog žmonės tokie yra. Lietuvoje tom pačiom propagandom tikėjo, tenais būtų tom pačiom tikėję, tiesiog sakau čia jo.
Is just to send them running at the front line anyways. After this is all said and done, Wagner troops must then endure one final scam, the one where Wagner does everything in its power to avoid paying its promised $71,000 restitution to the families of fallen fighters. Wagner apparently has a policy of no body, no payment, meaning that families cannot collect restitution payments unless they can provide the body of the fallen soldier as proof. So when men fall and die in areas where it is too dangerous to retrieve them, as is often the case given Wagner's dangerous mission, their families are simply out of luck. Unless, as some families have actually done, they go to Ukraine and negotiate to retrieve the body themselves. But this is assuming that the family is even notified of the death in the first place, which apparently can't be taken for granted, as, according to some reports, Wagner is even going to great lengths to keep the deaths of its fighters secret, burying them in special, private cemeteries, and often not even telling their family members that they have fallen. This lack of dignity and value for soldiers may explain the final reason why Russia was willing to sacrifice so many men in their attempt to capture Bakhmut. And that is for the simple reason that Russia does not actually care about these men, especially those that it can write off as expendable prisoners. In a morbid twist, some have speculated that Vladimir Putin...
Ir techniškai žiūrint iš tos pusės, gerai 100,000, ne? Tarkim, 2 artimieji on average, kas turbūt net nėra teisybė, bet tarkim, 2 artimieji on average, gerai, 200,000 žmonių, jo teisingai, 200,000 žmonių, kurie liko, kaip čia, gedėti savo netekto žmogaus. Kas yra tie 200,000? Net jeigu jie visiškai visi išeitų į gatves protestuoti, jie išmėtyti po visą Rusiją. Po kaimus, kaimelius, miestelius, tai yra nulinis skaičius. Lygins Rusijos populiacija, žinai, gyventojų skaičium. Tipo, ir jo ten, jeigu jie sukurs grupę, 20,000 žmonių Facebooko ten kokioje grupėje, savo kontaktai ten, ar ten Telegramo grupėje, kur vieni su kitais bendraus, jo, čia mano sūnus dingo, mano sūnus, tipo, ir nesako mums, atkasim teisybę. Ir ką? Ir kas? Tai yra tiesiog paputė vėjas, vanduos kažkur lašas nukrito masyvioje jūroje ir tai nepakankamai dideli skaičiai iš statistinės tokios pusės žiūrint, žinai. Tai daugiau negu 2, čia jau perspaudė mažiau kokie 5. Manai? Gal, nežinau, aš sakyčiau, kad ten visai gal nemažai tokių buvo, kur ir šeimų jokių ten nelabai turi. Arba tų, kur ten gedėtų, jeigu iš kalėjimų įma, žinai, kiek jie ten turės. Jo, aš nežinau, gal gerai 300,000, čia net jeigu po 500,000, čia nulinis skaičius techniškai. Jie net kai eidami gatves visiškai nieko nepasiektų, jeigu visiškai visi išeitų vienu metu, žinai. Tai tiesiog per mažas skaičius, net, tai jo, tai ir nėra baimės tos, ir jo miršta, ir ką, ir nieko, tipo.
May actually be using these deaths to hide the true cost of the war from the Russian people, since every prisoner that dies on the front line serves to lower Russian prison expenditures. Russia throws prisoners at the Ukrainian front, absorbing munitions that would otherwise be spent on regular soldiers, and frees itself of the burden for paying for those prisoners all at the same time. A barbarous, completely twisted win-win for Putin. And the scariest part is that this logic could also apply to any other undesirables that Putin decides to conscript into the army, allowing him to eliminate his opponents without having to issue the death penalty himself. This is the barbarous nature of the war that the world finds itself in. After all this, some will still ask, why has Russia sacrificed 100,000 men to capture Bakhmut? But given all these details, the question is, do you really expect a logical answer? After all, if mere logic was being employed, the war would never have been started in the first place. As you can imagine, I receive a lot of critical comments on my videos, but I do not...
Okay, čia enough. Toks, nežinau, The Icarus Project, nežinau, toks keistokas man video vis tiek. Man atrodo labai čia, nu aišku, labai šališkas, čia tikrai taip, bet toks, nemanau net, kad labai sąžininga reprezentacija buvo gerų, aišku, pointų. Bet,
Koks vakaras ilgas, kaip širdį man gelia. Nuskink man jazminą,